The date was September 12, 1897. On a rocky ridge in the rugged northwest frontier of British India, 21 Sikh soldiers stood at the tiny outpost of Saragarhi. Below them, a sea of shadows moved. An estimated 10,000 Afghan tribesmen were advancing across the dry, uneven terrain, their war cries piercing the morning air like rolling thunder. For decades, the British had struggled to hold the frontier against these tribal warriors, but this morning, the full fury of the Waziri Pashtun was coming directly at them. And yet, on that small stone outpost, the men of the 36th Sikh Regiment prepared to meet impossible odds, knowing that surrender was not an option. The fortress itself was little more than a line of low stone walls and earthworks, a tiny fortification perched between two hills. Saragarhi's strategic importance was not in its size, but its position. It was the lifeline connecting Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, two larger British garrisons in the region. If the outpost fell, the chain of communication would collapse, leaving the forts isolated and vulnerable. For the men on the ridge, this meant one thing: hold the line or die trying. The message they carried was simple: do not let the enemy pass. To understand the magnitude of the task, you must understand the men themselves. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were Sikhs of the 36th Regiment, trained in the harshest conditions the British Indian Army could devise. From a young age, they had been drilled in marksmanship, bayonet work, and the brutal art of frontier combat. Their bodies were honed for endurance, their minds sharpened for strategy, their spirits forged in the belief that courage was not optional. Each man knew that the only way to survive a fight like this was to trust his training, his comrades, and his faith. Opposing them, the Afghan tribesmen were a storm of sheer numbers and desperation. Mounted on horses or moving on foot, the warriors brought everything they had learned from generations of fighting across the mountains. Their weapons were crude but effective: swords, spears, and rifles captured from previous raids. Yet what they lacked in precision, they made up for in ferocity. They knew the terrain, they knew the stakes, and they knew that the British garrison at Saragarhi represented the thin barrier between them and total dominance over the forts. For them, this was not just a battle. It was a chance to reclaim honor and wealth from their colonial occupiers. But the odds, even for the Afghan warriors, were staggering: 21 men against 10,000, a ratio that should have guaranteed instant annihilation. By every calculation of warfare, Saragarhi was doomed before the first shot was fired. Yet this was not a battle that could be measured in numbers alone. It would be measured in skill, in nerve, in unyielding determination, in the extraordinary capacity of a few to change the course of history, even if only for a moment. As dawn broke, the soldiers on the ridge took their positions. Every man was assigned a sector of fire. Every rifle was checked and rechecked. Messages were sent by heliograph to Fort Lockhart, reporting the enemy's movement. The men of Saragarhi knew that reinforcements, if they came at all, would arrive too late. This knowledge did not paralyze them, it steeled them. Their commander, Havildar Ishar Singh, a veteran of frontier warfare, moved along the ramparts, quietly inspecting each man's readiness. There was no panic, no hesitation, only focus, only resolve, only the unspoken understanding that this fight would demand everything: life, strength, courage, and perhaps even sacrifice. By mid-morning, the Afghan warriors had reached the base of the ridge. Their movements were calculated, disciplined in a terrifying way, as if every man knew his place in the assault. And yet, they underestimated the Sikh defenders. From behind their stone walls, the 21 soldiers unleashed a volley of fire, so precise it seemed almost supernatural. Every shot found its mark, thinning the enemy ranks, slowing the advance, and planting doubt where there should have been confidence. For a brief moment, the impossible seemed plausible, but the Afghans adapted quickly. They began probing the walls, searching for weak points, attempting to flank the small garrison. Each movement was met with calm, measured response. Singh and his men rotated their firing positions, never allowing fatigue or panic to break the rhythm of their defense. The noise of gunfire, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the cries of the dying and wounded, all became the orchestra of a battle that no one could have imagined surviving. What made this defense extraordinary was not just the skill of the soldiers, but their psychological mastery over the situation. They understood that terror can multiply the effectiveness of a small force, and they used every moment to amplify the Afghans' hesitation. Every shot fired, every shout, every move along the ramparts was choreographed to suggest a force much larger than 21 men. The illusion of strength became as important as strength itself, and for hours, that illusion held. Yet as the day wore on, the disparity in numbers began to tell. The Afghans pressed harder, waves upon waves of warriors attempting to breach the walls. Ammunition ran low, exhaustion set in, and the constant assault tested the limits of human endurance. Yet Singh refused to abandon his post. One by one, his men fell, either killed or gravely wounded, but each death was met with renewed determination from the survivors. Each shot fired, each enemy repelled, became a testament to the resolve of these 21 men against a force beyond imagining. By late afternoon, the Afghans had learned something crucial. The outpost was not just holding, it was breaking their will. Their numerical advantage was blunted by the disciplined, relentless, almost superhuman resistance of the Sikh soldiers. This small group, isolated and outnumbered by thousands, had become a symbol of defiance. The battlefield had transformed from a simple assault into a moral and psychological struggle. Every Afghan warrior who fell was not just a casualty, but a reinforcement for the legend that was being forged on that rocky ridge. And then, as the shadows lengthened and the sun dipped toward the horizon, the true scale of the heroism at Saragarhi became clear. These 21 men, facing annihilation, had delayed the enemy long enough to allow Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan to prepare, to reinforce, and to avoid total disaster. Their stand had created a pause in the chaos of an otherwise unstoppable assault, buying precious hours that would alter the course of the frontier war. The ridge, once a simple strategic point, had become a crucible of courage. The Afghans had surrounded the small outpost, yet even as death loomed from every side, Havildar Ishar Singh and his men refused to surrender. Each decision, each shot, each calculated movement would echo across generations, not just in military textbooks, but in the memory of a people whose stories would be told with reverence for over a century. By the end of the day, only Havildar Singh remained standing. He fought to the last, rifle in hand, facing impossible odds and overwhelming numbers, embodying the ultimate principle of sacrifice. And while Saragarhi would fall, the legend of the 21 Sikhs, their bravery, their skill, their unwavering determination, would outlast empires and become a touchstone for courage in the face of annihilation. This was more than a battle. It was a testament to the power of discipline, strategy, and psychological mastery. And it was just the beginning of a story that would inspire awe, study, and cinematic storytelling for generations to come. The morning had already become a crucible, yet the siege of Saragarhi was far from over. The Afghan warriors, realizing that brute force alone could not overwhelm the defenders, began coordinating their attacks with terrifying precision. Waves of mounted fighters approached from multiple directions, while small groups on foot attempted to scale the rocky slopes, seeking any crack in the stone walls. To the untrained eye, the outpost appeared doomed. 21 men against 10,000, stretched to the limit of endurance and rationed ammunition. Yet for Havildar Ishar Singh and his soldiers, this was exactly the kind of moment for which they had been trained their entire lives. Singh moved along the parapet, his eyes scanning every movement of the enemy below. Each Afghan advance was met with a calm, deliberate response. Shots rang out in measured volleys, each aimed to slow the tide without exposing a single weakness. Despite the overwhelming odds, the defenders rotated their firing positions to avoid exhaustion, conserving both strength and morale. Every action had purpose. Every decision reflected decades of discipline instilled in them by the rigorous training of the 36th Sikh Regiment. Their unity was their greatest weapon, a living mechanism of precision, courage, and unyielding focus. The Afghans, for all their numbers, were beginning to feel the psychological impact of Saragarhi's defense. Every assault was met with organized fire, every advance met with a counter. Casualties mounted, horses were shot, warriors fell into the dusty trenches, and yet the defenders remained resolute. The Afghan leaders, who had assumed that sheer numbers would intimidate and crush the outpost within hours, began to sense that this was no ordinary resistance. The men of Saragarhi had become more than soldiers. They had become an idea, a storm that refused to break despite the impossible arithmetic of war. By mid-afternoon, the battle had taken on a rhythm, a deadly choreography. The Afghans would charge, the Sikhs would fire, and the cycle would repeat. Yet Singh understood something critical. The Afghans were not invincible. Their confidence could be manipulated. He began varying the timing and intensity of defensive volleys, creating the illusion of dwindling ammunition in some sectors while maintaining full strength in others. The enemy interpreted this as weakness, advancing where they thought the defense was faltering. It was a small deception, but in battle, small deceptions could yield monumental consequences. As the sun climbed higher, the Sikhs faced yet another challenge. Their ammunition was finite, their bodies weary from hours of continuous fire, and the constant pressure of the enemy was unrelenting. In such moments, ordinary men would falter, panic, or surrender. But Singh's men were not ordinary. Each understood that their duty was absolute, their resolve unbreakable. Even as friends fell beside them, even as dust and blood blurred the battlefield, every survivor maintained discipline, using strategy as much as courage to prolong their stand. The Afghans shifted tactics again, this time employing fire and smoke, attempting to force the defenders from their stone fortifications. They ignited small brush fires below the walls, sending smoke curling toward the ridge, hoping to obscure vision and create chaos. But Singh anticipated this, rotating his men to cover all sight lines and instructing sharpshooters to take advantage of any movement. Each flare of fire was met with deadly accuracy. Every attempt to disorient the defenders failed. By now, the psychological toll on the attackers was evident. Frustration began to replace confidence, and hesitation replaced aggression. It was during this phase that individual heroism became visible, moments that could define legends. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh climbed to exposed positions to fire upon advancing enemies, knowing the risk was almost certainly fatal. Private Lal Singh used the loopholes in the stone walls to pick off approaching warriors, dropping one after another in rapid succession. Their actions were not reckless but calculated, a precise combination of bravery, skill, and an understanding that their smallest actions could buy precious minutes for the forts below. Each soldier at Saragarhi had internalized a profound truth. Courage under fire was not optional. It was survival, and survival meant protecting more than just themselves. By late afternoon, the pressure on Saragarhi intensified even further. The Afghans, realizing that frontal assaults were failing, began attempting flanking maneuvers. Groups of warriors tried to find paths up the ridge that were less defended, seeking any breach. The defenders countered by shifting positions seamlessly, maintaining overlapping fields of fire and rotating exhausted men to fresh sectors. Singh's command was absolute, not through fear, but through trust, clarity, and the unspoken bond forged between soldiers facing certain death together. It was a tactical masterpiece played out on a scale so small, it could have been mistaken for routine frontier skirmish, if not for the staggering odds. In one dramatic encounter, a large group of attackers breached the outer trench at the base of the walls. Immediately, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh and two others charged to engage them, hand-to-hand, rifles and bayonets clashing against swords and spears. The fight was brutal, intimate, and almost cinematic in its intensity. For every Afghan warrior who fell, another replaced him. Yet, remarkably, Singh's men maintained composure, moving like a single organism, defending every inch of the ridge with lethal precision. Outside, the broader battle seemed chaotic and overwhelming. But inside the small fortress, it was a display of strategic brilliance and unmatched discipline. Even as shadows lengthened and the day waned, the defenders of Saragarhi continued to repulse waves of attackers. They were exhausting every ounce of strength, yet the relentless pressure could not break their cohesion. Each volley, each defensive action, was magnified by psychological impact. The Afghans began to hesitate, doubting that a force so small could maintain such perfect timing and firepower. This hesitation, born of awe and fear, became an invisible weapon in the defenders' arsenal. The very legend of Saragarhi was being forged in real time, as myth and strategy merged into one extraordinary moment of human courage. By dusk, only a handful of men remained fully able to fight. Ammunition was nearly spent, exhaustion had reached unbearable levels, and yet Havildar Ishar Singh continued to command, moving along the walls to coordinate every last action. Every decision was now a life or death calculation: when to fire, when to reload, when to counterattack. Singh understood that their stand was not just about holding Saragarhi, but about buying time, delaying the enemy, and preserving the strategic integrity of the frontier. Every second gained was a victory, every setback a lesson quickly adapted to in the heat of battle. As night approached, the Afghans realized that the small outpost had not only resisted but had inflicted serious casualties. Their numerical advantage was slowly being eroded by a combination of disciplined fire, terrain mastery, and psychological warfare. Saragarhi, though diminutive in size, had become a force that defied expectation, a symbolic giant of resistance. And at the center of this extraordinary defense stood Havildar Ishar Singh, the last living embodiment of a regiment that had turned the impossible into a temporary, breathtaking reality. By holding the ridge for hours against overwhelming odds, the 21 men of Saragarhi had achieved what no conventional military wisdom could explain. They had bought time for the neighboring forts, inflicted significant losses on the enemy, and demonstrated that courage, discipline, and strategy could magnify the impact of a force so small it should have been annihilated within moments. The battle was far from over, but the stage had been set for a climax that would etch these soldiers into history, ensuring that their names would be remembered long after empires faded and borders shifted. By the time the sun dipped behind the jagged hills, the ridge at Saragarhi had become a different world entirely. Smoke drifted across the courtyard, dust mixed with blood, and the once precise lines of defense were now scattered with the bodies of fallen heroes. Yet the outpost still stood. It still breathed. It still fought. And so did Havildar Ishar Singh. Only a small handful of defenders remained alive. Many were injured, bleeding, barely able to stand. Some clutched rifles with trembling hands. Others leaned against the stone walls for balance. But none turned away. None surrendered. Each man understood the weight of this moment. The enemy had expected an easy victory, a swift crushing of a tiny outpost, and instead they had been held at bay for nearly an entire day. The delay alone was a strategic miracle. The psychological impact was even greater. But now the Afghans were preparing for their final, all-or-nothing assault. War drums echoed across the valley, slow at first, then accelerating into a pulse that seemed to vibrate through the stones themselves. Torches ignited in the gathering darkness, turning the slopes into a sea of flickering orange lights. Tens of thousands of warriors moved like a living wave, circling the ridge, tightening the noose with every passing minute. They had lost too many men, wasted too many hours. Whatever fear the defenders had instilled earlier was now overshadowed by fury. The time for probing attacks was over. This final charge would end everything. Inside the fortress, Ishar Singh gathered the survivors. There was no speech. There was no time. Their faces already understood everything. This would be their last stand. Their ammunition was nearly gone, their rifles growing hot from the day's endless firing. Only a few bullets remained, and everyone had to count. Singh issued the last commands with calm precision. 2 men would remain at the heliograph station. Their mission was not to survive, but to keep sending updates to Fort Lockhart until the very moment the walls were breached. Others were positioned at the gates, some at the parapets. Every man covered a critical angle. Every man played a role. And in the middle of it all stood Singh, unbowed, unbroken, carrying wounds that would have felled anyone less determined. When the Afghans advanced, they did so like a tidal wave. Their chants filled the valley, a deafening roar that rolled over the ridge like thunder. From the walls, the defenders fired their last bullets with surgical precision, dropping warriors at the front of the charge to slow the momentum. But the wave didn't slow, it accelerated. Within seconds, the final bullets were gone. The battle that followed was no longer one of rifles and volleys. It was a primal struggle fought with bayonets, swords, rifle butts, and bare hands. The Afghans swarmed the walls, climbing over each other to reach the defenders. The Sikhs met them head-on. They stood shoulder to shoulder in narrow choke points, forcing the attackers into bottlenecks where even a handful of men could hold back dozens. Their turbans now carried streaks of dust and blood. Their uniforms were torn. Their bodies were beyond exhaustion. But their spirit did not waver. Every defender fought with the fury of a man who knew his life was already spent. Sepoy Bhagwan Singh was seen swinging his rifle like a club, striking down anyone who crossed the breach. Sepoy Hira Singh fought with a bayonet until it snapped, then picked up a fallen sword without hesitation. Even the wounded dragged themselves back into the fight, pulling attackers down by their ankles, clawing at them, slowing them just long enough for another defender to strike. Inside the stone courtyard, the ground trembled under the weight of the assault. Dust filled the air. Torches were hurled over the walls, igniting parts of the outpost. Smoke thickened, making it difficult to breathe, but the defenders refused to fall back. Then came the moment that would immortalize Saragarhi forever. As the defenders were overwhelmed near the main gate, Ishar Singh stepped forward. He did not retreat. He advanced, alone, straight into the surge of warriors. For hours he had commanded the battle with brilliant strategy, but now his role changed. Now he became the final wall between his men and the enemy. With a roar that cut through the smoke-filled air, he charged downhill, sword in hand, crashing into the Afghan line all by himself. Witnesses from Fort Lockhart later reported that they could see his silhouette from a distance. One man fighting against dozens, each stroke of his blade carving out a few more seconds of life for the defenders behind him. He fought as if he were not a single soldier, but the embodiment of the entire regiment. Even when he was struck, even when he stumbled, he rose again. His defiance became a symbol so powerful that even the attackers, men hardened by generations of tribal warfare, hesitated before approaching him. But no man, not even one forged in iron, can fight an army forever. Ishar Singh fell only after killing until he physically could not lift his weapon again. His sacrifice bought crucial time, just enough for the last act of heroism inside the fort. With the commander fallen, the surviving defenders retreated into the inner courtyard. Among them was the youngest soldier at Saragarhi, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, barely 19. He had spent the entire day manning the heliograph, sending constant updates to Fort Lockhart under extreme danger. Now, surrounded by enemies and hearing the screams of battle behind him, he tapped out one final message. They have reached the walls. I understand what I must do. Then he picked up his rifle, whispered a prayer, and joined the final stand. He held the doorway alone, firing single shots with perfect placement, every bullet buying a few more seconds. When his ammunition finally ran dry, he fixed his bayonet and charged forward, meeting the attackers head-on. Witnesses later described hearing his final battle cry echo across the ridge long after the fighting had ended. By nightfall, Saragarhi was silent. The Afghans had taken the outpost, but at a cost so staggering that even they were forced to acknowledge the bravery of the defenders. Stories spread among the tribal ranks of the 21 lions who had stood against thousands. Many Afghan warriors removed their turbans in respect as they passed the bodies of the fallen Sikhs, a gesture of profound honor in their culture. When British forces finally retook the ridge the next day, they found a scene frozen in heroism. 21 bodies positioned exactly where they had been fighting, weapons still in hand, enemies piled around them. The scale of the resistance was so astonishing that the British Parliament declared the stand at Saragarhi one of the greatest acts of collective bravery in the history of warfare. Every defender was posthumously awarded the highest Indian military honor. Their names became legend. Their regiment became immortal. And Saragarhi itself, a tiny stone outpost on a lonely ridge, became a symbol of absolute courage. A reminder that even in the face of impossible odds, a small group of determined men can hold back the world and reshape the course of history. The story of Saragarhi is not one of victory or defeat. It is one of honor, of sacrifice, of what it means to stand your ground when the world expects you to fall. These 21 men did not just fight a battle. They carved their names into eternity. If this moved you, smash that like. Share this with someone who needs to see what real courage looks like, and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss another battle where strategy beats strength. Drop a comment with the impossible fight you want next. Your idea could be our next video.